In the winter of 1884, a child was born into a world that would never forgive him for what he could not control. His name was Edward Simmons, but history has almost erased him. You will not find him in textbooks, not in sanitized records, only in whispers, in fragmented diaries, in the yellowed pages of newspapers meant to terrify rather than inform. They called him the boy whose eyes never closed. And that is no exaggeration. You must understand, this was no ordinary insomnia. Edward never blinked, never slept, never surrendered to the darkness that consumes every human mind. From the moment he was born, his eyes were windows into a truth no one dared confront, a truth that gnawed at the foundation of reality itself. Doctors came, scholars, ministers, even charlatans, each trying to explain him, each failing, each retreating in fear. They observed him through the nights, scribbled notes in hushed voices, and yet none could comprehend what they saw. Edward's eyes were mirrors reflecting the unseen, shadows that moved independently, patterns in the wind, intentions in human hearts before they were spoken. And he never closed them. You must imagine what it means for a boy to live without rest, to witness the world with relentless clarity while the rest of humanity drifts blindly through illusions. Every day, every hour, he absorbed what others were blind to. His mind became a repository for knowledge no child should carry, knowledge that terrifies even the learned. The townsfolk called him cursed. Some whispered of demonic possession, others claimed he was a messenger of forces they could not name. Parents would shiver and pull their children inside when he walked past, sensing that the air itself thickened with his presence. Yet Edward never retaliated, never spoke of vengeance. His eyes alone were enough. They revealed everything they wanted to hide, every lie, every secret, every dark intention. And in that small, cold town, people began to change their behavior, not because of guilt, but because they felt watched by something that was not human, not mortal, not to be understood. And here, right now, I need you to pause just for a heartbeat, because what I am about to tell you will shatter the comforting narratives you hold. Edward Simmons was not merely a boy. He was the first witness, the living proof that certain truths are too dangerous for ordinary minds, that the world is governed by shadows, by currents of power that we can neither see nor challenge, yet someone, somewhere, always sees. And sometimes that someone is a child who never closes his eyes. By the age of 5, Edward Simmons had become a spectacle, though not one celebrated in fairs or theater. His existence threatened the fragile illusions people relied upon to survive. Every whispered word about him carried a subtle fear, a trembling acknowledgement that life, as they knew it, might be a lie. Scholars arrived from distant cities, their credentials irrelevant in the presence of a child whose perception outstripped every formula, every theory. They observed, they measured, they tested, and they left with haunted eyes, muttering of phenomena that could unravel the very structure of human understanding. Edward's gaze, unyielding and unblinking, seemed to probe their motives, to map the corners of their consciousness that they themselves had never explored. It was not just curiosity that drew the learned, nor simple fear. It was a compulsion. They could not resist seeing what Edward could see, feeling what Edward could feel. And yet, every attempt to control him, to study him, to bend him into a human subject ended in failure. The instruments they brought, the charts, the notes, the elaborate devices of measurement, all collapsed into irrelevance when placed before the boy whose eyes never closed. He moved through their calculations as if they were smoke, leaving only the bitter taste of revelation behind. He understood them as they did not understand themselves, reading intentions before words were formed, tracing hidden currents of greed, jealousy, and terror that flowed beneath the polite facades of adults. Even the local authorities began to notice. Strange occurrences followed him like shadows that never left his side. Objects displaced, small fires appearing without cause, animals skittish in his presence, shadows bending unnaturally. People claimed that the night itself seemed to avoid him, that a darkness would lift when he passed by, or descend where he lingered. Some whispered that he was connected to a force older than civilization itself, a sentience that the human mind could only faintly comprehend. And yet Edward did not smile at the chaos, nor did he revel in it. His eyes were not cruel, they were observant, impartial, and relentless. They reflected truth with a clarity that made even the most confident man feel naked, exposed, unworthy. As you listen now, imagine how that must feel to live in a world where nothing hides from you and where every secret, every manipulation, every hidden agenda comes to light simply because you exist. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a story meant to entertain. It is the beginning of an awakening, the edge of knowledge that most men dare not approach. Because once you see it, once you truly feel the currents beneath the surface of society, there is no going back. You are no longer blind, no longer safe. By the time Edward reached his 8th year, the world around him had already divided into those who feared him and those who sought to exploit him. He was no longer simply a child. He had become a nexus, a focal point where hidden powers, both human and otherwise, converged. Secret societies, men in scholarly robes, and shadowed figures from distant cities began to visit the town. They approached politely under the guise of study, philanthropy, or guardianship. Yet their intentions were clear. They wanted to harness what Edward represented. A boy whose eyes never closed was not just an anomaly, he was a potential key. A key to knowledge, to control, to power that ordinary men could not even dream of wielding. They did not care about him as a child, they cared about what he could see and what he could make visible. His gaze, unblinking, unrelenting, was both a threat and a promise. And those who understood its significance spoke in whispers, fearing the consequences of being overheard. Edward's every move, every glance, every quiet observation became the subject of meticulous record. Maps of his behavior, coded notes, rituals to predict his reactions. They believed they could manipulate a mind that had never slept, a mind that had absorbed centuries of truth from the shadows of the world. But Edward was not naive. Though his body was small, his awareness was vast. He recognized the subtle signals of manipulation, the gestures of control, the hidden intentions behind the polite words of adults. And he refused to comply, though not through rebellion. Instead, he acted with the calm inevitability of someone who knows the currents beneath the surface. A misplaced object here, a subtle revelation there, a secret exposed without malice. Edward became an invisible hand, demonstrating power without needing to wield it directly. Those who tried to control him found themselves ensnared in a web they could not understand, their own agendas unraveling under the weight of the truths they had sought to conceal. The town began to change quietly. Families whispered among themselves, behaviors shifted, and even the most cynical began to behave as if watched. Not by government inspectors, not by lawmen, but by something older, more absolute. Edward's presence illuminated corruption in ways that could not be ignored. Institutions that prided themselves on order and civility were exposed as fragile facades, their hidden agendas laid bare. And yet Edward remained silent, his eyes recording, observing, remembering. You must understand, he was not malicious nor heroic. He was the mirror, and a mirror once confronted leaves no escape for those unwilling to see. By his 10th year, Edward's existence was no longer merely an oddity. It had become a disruption. The town itself seemed to fracture under his gaze. Men who had once been confident in their power over families, businesses, and local politics began to falter. A subtle paranoia crept into conversations, unspoken yet palpable, as if some unseen authority weighed over them. Ordinary decisions, loans, trades, marriages, were made with hesitation. People felt the presence of eyes that saw more than the human eye should ever perceive, and they were right. Edward's vision was not limited to the physical. It penetrated intention, whispered thoughts, unvoiced plans. Teachers reported strange phenomena in classrooms. Children who had once acted freely became hesitant, as if guided by a consciousness beyond their comprehension. Adults claimed to overhear their own secrets spoken aloud in private rooms, only to find no one there. The weight of observation, relentless and impartial, altered behavior in ways subtle but irreversible. The town's institutions, schools, churches, even the police, adapted unconsciously, trying to survive under scrutiny they could not name. And yet, no one could confront Edward directly. To do so was to reveal oneself, to surrender the illusion of control. His eyes were not accusatory, they were mirrors, and mirrors demand truth. Psychologists of the era, those rare few who dared approach the child, noted an unsettling consistency. Edward's mind operated outside the limits of human sleep cycles. Without rest, he catalogued every gesture, every expression, every fluctuation of power around him. He began to predict patterns of human manipulation even before the adults themselves. Vez were aware of their schemes. He witnessed lies before they were spoken, corruption before it was enacted, ambition before it manifested, and he did nothing except observe. Some scholars concluded that Edward had become a silent instrument of societal correction, a living conscience too pure and relentless for ordinary humans to bear. Yet, while some feared him, others saw opportunity. Shadowed figures, men and women whose wealth or power depended on secrecy, tried to manipulate him, to bend his awareness into their service. They underestimated the simple principle. Edward could see through pretense, strategy, and even deception itself. They believed his youth would limit him. They thought sleep deprivation and isolation would weaken him. But Edward had never known weakness. His awareness became a kind of armor, each unblinking hour sharpening perception, refining intuition, expanding memory. To confront him was to reveal one's own mind, naked and exposed, and most could not endure that. At this point, if you feel the weight of Edward's gaze through these words, pause, reflect. Because what you are about to understand is even darker. His presence did not just expose hidden agendas, it rewrote the boundaries of control, showing that no institution, no individual could fully conceal their true self, and some truths once seen cannot be unseen. By the age of 12, Edward's life had shifted from the merely extraordinary into the realm of legend, though he was still flesh and blood. Whispers of his presence reached beyond the town, carried by travelers, merchants, and those curious enough to seek him out. But Edward did not travel. He did not need to. His reputation alone altered behavior, as if the mere knowledge of his existence triggered some deeper, almost arcane mechanism within society. Men and women began to act differently, their own morality bending under invisible observation, their hidden corruption illuminated without effort. The world around him was a network of secrets, and Edward, unknowingly, had become the node that could expose them all. Yet there was something more, something older than the town or the century in which he lived. Certain symbols appeared around him, scribbled in journals, etched into furniture, whispered in ritual by those who claimed to understand. He did not participate in these signs, but he observed them, and through his unblinking eyes he seemed to absorb the knowledge they contained. These were fragments of something deliberately hidden, occult structures of power, psychological control systems devised long before Edward's time, strategies for domination encoded in human institutions. Some men had studied them in secret, others had destroyed evidence to keep the masses compliant. Edward did not need to study. He was a living decoder, an unintentional key to what the powerful had always tried to conceal. Families reported dreams that shifted after an encounter with him, visions of hierarchies, of hidden councils, of decisions made far from public scrutiny. Some claimed that Edward's gaze could penetrate the veil, revealing not only intent, but the deeper currents of influence, the flow of power that moves silently through history. People began to sense that their lives were not their own, that forces older than governments, older than religion, were shaping them. And in the center of that awareness, Edward stood, a child with the mind of centuries and the eyes to match. By now, Edward was no longer just a boy in a town. He had become a symbol of forbidden knowledge, a living reminder that some truths are meant to unsettle, to awaken, to disrupt. And here, if you are paying attention, you are beginning to understand something crucial. The forces surrounding Edward are not just external. They are inside every institution, every family, every human hierarchy. And Edward, through simple existence, exposed them all. Halfway through this journey, I want you to engage. Comment the phrase, "The eyes of truth," once, then again, so you anchor yourself in what you are about to witness. Let the words mark your awareness. This is more than participation, it is alignment with knowledge that changes how you see the world. because after this nothing will feel the same. After his 12th year, Edward's existence attracted men whose reach extended far beyond the town's borders, men who operated in shadows, whose names never appeared in newspapers or legal records. They arrived quietly, in carriages cloaked by night or letters sealed with obscure symbols. Their interest was not curiosity, it was control. They saw in Edward a child who could perceive what they had spent lifetimes hiding, a being who threatened the careful architectures of their secret orders, and so they began to plan, to manipulate, to test. But what they did not realize was that Edward's mind was no ordinary mind. He was a living compass, able to detect deception, predict intent, and observe truths that were invisible to others. Experiments were subtle at first. The boy was observed through the night, woken repeatedly to gauge endurance. Strange instruments were brought to measure his reactions, devices of psychology and mechanics designed to map his perception. Yet all these contrivances failed. They could not contain him. Every intrusion into his life, every attempt at coercion revealed not the child's weakness, but the weakness of those who sought to dominate him. Edward did not resist in anger. He simply existed, exposing the fragility of those who believed they were in control, and each failure emboldened him, sharpening the clarity of his unblinking eyes and the precision of his awareness. What the men did not comprehend was that Edward's perception extended beyond observation. He absorbed the hidden structure of human networks, the patterns of power, the psychology of obedience, the invisible systems of manipulation that controlled families, communities, and governments alike. Each secret, once revealed through him, forced the world to recalibrate unconsciously. Those who thought themselves masters of strategy discovered that the boy had already anticipated their moves, his presence altering the outcome before a single decision was made. And so the town became a testing ground not for Edward, but for those who underestimated the human cost of meddling with forces beyond comprehension. Even the more experienced operatives, men versed in occult science and secret societies, found themselves vulnerable. They began to slip, exposing inconsistencies in their own power structures. Decisions they had taken for granted faltered, alliances broke apart, confidences were unintentionally revealed, and yet Edward remained silent, his eyes documenting everything. It was as if he had become the living ledger of human ambition and deceit. Impartial, and unblinking. You must understand, his story is not just about a boy. It is about what happens when the illusions of control confront raw perception. Institutions crumble, secrets leak, and men lose the comfort of believing they are untouchable. And as you follow this, remember, what you are witnessing is dangerous knowledge. Once seen, once understood, it changes the very way a man perceives power, truth, and himself. By his 14th year, Edward Simmons had become more than a child of flesh and bone. He was a vessel for truths long hidden, truths older than the very institutions that sought to control him. In the diaries of scholars and the secret ledgers of clandestine societies, there were scattered references to phenomena they could not explain, children who perceived the currents of influence, witnesses who saw the machinery behind human events. Edward was such a witness, but unlike any before him, he carried the weight of centuries in his unblinking gaze. Every look, every observation was a mapping of systems, a decoding of corruption, a revelation of agendas concealed from ordinary men. And Coim, in texts hint at what some called the Watcher, a being whose eyes never closed, who bore witness to cycles of power repeating across generations. Edward's existence mirrored these myths in disturbing clarity. He did not speak of destiny, nor did he understand it fully, but his life became intertwined with forces that had long operated in shadows. Secret societies, whose purpose had always been to manipulate perception, were drawn into his orbit. They whispered of prophecy, of forbidden knowledge, of the consequences of a world suddenly illuminated by unblinking sight. And Edward, in the simple act of being, disrupted all of it. Power, when unobserved, grows unchecked. Institutions consolidate control, men manipulate, and societies obey in ignorance. But Edward's gaze was the opposite of that. His eyes exposed what was hidden, unveiling patterns and connections no map could chart. Leaders and operatives who had relied on deception began to falter. Contracts, unspoken promises, hidden alliances, they all became visible under the relentless scrutiny of a boy who could never rest. Those who attempted to conceal their actions discovered too late that secrecy was meaningless. Edward did not need to act to change the world. His awareness alone reshaped it. And still, his observers underestimated him. They brought symbols, rituals, and archaic methods to test him, believing they could channel, contain, or redirect his perception. But the boy was more than a subject. He was a mirror of knowledge and intent. Each attempt to manipulate him became a lesson in humility for those who thought themselves masters of systems they barely understood. Edward's presence forced them to confront the fragility of human constructs and the illusion of control. The world around him quivered under truths too vast, too ancient, and too dangerous to be ignored. Now, reflect on this. Edward Simmons was not just observing history, he was revealing the mechanisms behind it, and in witnessing him you are witnessing a lesson that every man must confront. Power, truth, and perception are never what they seem. Once the eyes of truth are opened, the illusions crumble, and the world becomes a far darker place than you ever imagined. By his 16th year, Edward Simmons had become a living reckoning. Those who had once approached him with subtle gestures and polite curiosity now arrived with purpose, with plans, with strategies designed to bend his unblinking mind to their will. Scholars, occultists, and shadowed operatives convened in secret, each believing they could dominate him, each believing that their knowledge, their rituals, their meticulous systems were sufficient. But Edward had become something they could not predict, something no instrument, no formula, no arcane method could capture. He was the ultimate observer, a mind untouchable, and a force that rendered manipulation meaningless. The psychological toll on his pursuers was immediate. Men who had devoted decades to control and secrecy began to unravel. Subtle mistakes appeared in their calculations. Alliances crumbled under pressure. Confidences were accidentally revealed. Scholars recorded their findings in trembling scripts, their handwriting betraying anxiety they could not disguise. Men of supposed rationality became paranoid, unable to distinguish thought from deception, suspicion from reality. And yet, Edward remained calm, silent, unblinking. The boy had become a mirror reflecting not just truth, but the fragility of human ambition. Some attempted rituals, drawing from centuries-old manuscripts, invoking authority and power in ways meant to subdue him. Symbols etched in candlelight, incantations whispered in fear, devices intended to measure or manipulate. Nothing worked. Edward did not need to respond. Observation alone sufficed. The energy he radiated, the awareness he projected, shattered pretense without effort. He became a psychological weapon, though unintentional. Every plan to dominate him became an act of self-exposure, a demonstration of how deeply hidden currents of control were vulnerable to exposure by a mind unbound by sleep, by fatigue, by the common limits of human perception. And the town? It had become a theater of subtle terror. Ordinary citizens, unaware of the operative's intentions, still sensed shifts in behavior, tremors of unspoken tension. Adults altered their patterns unconsciously, avoiding certain streets, speaking in guarded tones, doubting their own judgment. Edward's presence exposed the invisible hand of power, revealing that society was a delicate construct, a fragile network of compliance and deception, and he did not intervene. He observed, he catalogued, he remained the unblinking eye in a world teetering on the edge of revelation. Here is what you must understand. This is not a tale of a prodigy or a paranormal curiosity. This is a lesson in perception, control, and the vulnerability of human constructs when confronted by awareness that cannot be deceived. And now, I want you to reinforce your own engagement. Comment, "Eyes of Truth" twice, letting the phrase anchor you in the reality that knowledge changes perception, and perception changes power. Because once you internalize this, nothing will feel the same again. By the age of 18, Edward Simmons had become more than a curiosity. His life was now a lens through which the unseen machinery of society could be observed, dissected, and exposed. Scholars, secret societies, and local authorities no longer approached him simply to study. They came to understand how his presence disrupted centuries of hidden influence. What they discovered was alarming. Edward's gaze did not merely see. It illuminated the invisible threads binding institutions, governments, and elites, revealing the delicate architectures of control that allowed corruption to thrive unseen. Every meeting, every council, every hidden correspondence could be traced through him, as if Edward's consciousness extended beyond the town itself. He could detect patterns of power, psychological manipulations, and secret networks that most men believed were unknowable. These networks, built on obedience, secrecy, and fear, were exposed without a single word from him. One glance, one moment of observation could unravel strategies honed over decades. The very existence of a single boy with unblinking eyes threatened centuries of meticulous planning. Men who thought themselves untouchable discovered with growing horror that nothing they had concealed was safe. The deeper Edward's influence reached, the more desperate those around him became. Operatives attempted to entangle him in moral compromise, to force ethical concessions, to manipulate him into complicity. But Edward did not act through deceit or force. He simply observed. Observation became a weapon, an unblinking mirror that reflected human weakness, ambition, and hidden cruelty. Men found themselves exposed, their own schemes unraveling before they had a chance to act. Those who relied on intimidation or bribery discovered that their tactics were invisible to him, their intentions transparent, their control impossible. Even institutions built on authority faltered. Churches, local governments, educational systems all showed cracks under his silent scrutiny. Policy decisions, disciplinary actions, legal proceedings, all of it shifted imperceptibly as those involved adapted unconsciously to the weight of his awareness. Communities that had been held together by deception, manipulation, and fear began to destabilize quietly, subtly, as Edward's observation forced truth into every corner. It was not a revolution of violence, but a revolution of perception. And this is the lesson you must internalize. Edward Simmons was not merely a boy, and his story is not merely history. It is a demonstration of the fragility of power when confronted by awareness that cannot be fooled. Institutions, secrets, and agendas are all fragile constructs, exposed, revealed, and undone by one mind unbound by the limits of ordinary human perception. And as you listen, you must ask yourself, in your own world, whose truths remain hidden and who is watching? By the time Edward Simmons reached 20, it became clear that his life was a living audit of human control. The boy whose eyes never closed was no longer merely an observer. He had become a silent disruptor of centuries-old psychological systems designed to manipulate minds. Governments, religious institutions, educational structures, and elite societies all relied on obedience, conditioning, and illusion to maintain dominance. Edward did not participate in these systems. He simply existed, revealing their mechanisms with the clarity of a mind unshackled by sleep, distraction, or human fallacy. Scholars who had studied him meticulously documented behaviors they could not fully explain. Subtle shifts in conversation, exposure of hidden agendas, involuntary confessions, unconscious compliance, each triggered by the mere presence of his unblinking gaze. He did not coerce, did not interrogate. He observed, and the human psyche betrayed itself. Patterns that had gone unnoticed for generations became visible. Rituals of power, psychological traps designed to subjugate populations, and systems of obedience were revealed as fragile illusions under the relentless scrutiny of Edward's awareness. Those who had devoted their lives to maintaining these systems were forced into cognitive collapse. Manipulators discovered their own minds turning against them, strategies unraveling before they could be executed, carefully laid plans exposed with frightening precision. Edward had become unknowingly a disruptor of hierarchy itself, and those who understood this fact began to fear him not because of violence, but because of the truth he carried effortlessly in his unblinking eyes. The ripple effect extended far beyond his town. Scholars and operatives who had attempted to harness or contain him carried knowledge back to distant cities, governments, and secret councils. Patterns that had remained hidden for centuries were now revealed through Edward's influence. Social, political, and economic behaviors shifted subtly under the unseen force of his perception. Men and women believed themselves to be in control, only to find their intentions transparent, their authority hollow. The boy whose eyes never closed had become a mirror reflecting the fragility of civilization itself. And now, as you listen, you must consider your own perception. What truths lie hidden in your life, in your society, in your institutions? What invisible forces shape behavior around you? Edward's story is a demonstration that awareness is power, and that power is both terrifying and absolute when wielded unconsciously. Once you see the mechanisms of control, once you perceive the hidden currents, you cannot unsee them, and that is precisely the danger and the liberation that Edward Simmons represents. By Edward's 22nd year, it was no longer a question of curiosity or observation. Certain forces recognized him as a threat, an anomaly that could unravel not just local power structures but centuries of hidden agendas, secret councils, shadowed societies, and men whose names never crossed public records convened in whispers, planning ways to neutralize, erase, or co-opt him. Edward was not just a boy, not just a witness. He had become a living proof that the mechanisms of control were vulnerable to perception alone, and perception, when untamed, is dangerous. Attempts were made to isolate him, to create environments designed to weaken his vigilance, to force him into compliance. Rooms were dimmed, schedules disrupted, relationships manipulated, all in a calculated effort to break the unblinking awareness that had become so disruptive. Yet Edward endured. More than endurance, he thrived. Every attempt to limit him revealed the desperation of those who feared exposure. Each ritual, each coercive strategy, each hidden plot became a reflection of their own fragility, their own dependence on secrecy. They underestimated one simple truth. Edward's mind had already transcended the conventional boundaries they sought to impose. The operatives who had once been confident in their abilities began to falter psychologically. Documents disappeared, evidence misaligned itself, and plans that had taken decades to orchestrate failed without apparent cause. Edward did not intervene actively. He observed, and the systems collapsed of their own weight. His unblinking eyes had become a catalyst for revelation, a silent force that undermined manipulation by existing as a mirror to truth. Men of influence felt their own intentions unraveling, their own control slipping, and the more they tried to grasp it, the more it eluded them. Even institutions considered infallible, government departments, religious hierarchies, elite networks, were exposed as brittle and reactive under Edward's presence. Subtle shifts in behavior, unspoken admissions, micro-expressions undetectable to ordinary eyes, all became visible to him. Knowledge that had been suppressed, carefully guarded over centuries, surfaced inadvertently. And those who had sought to harness or erase him began to understand, too late, that the boy was not theirs to command. He was an instrument of truth, indifferent, unblinking, unstoppable. Now consider this. The very systems built to obscure, control, and dominate were rendered fragile by a single observer. Edward Simmons embodies a principle that transcends time. Awareness is power, and power that cannot be perceived is only illusion. And in witnessing this story, you are beginning to see the mechanisms of control that surround every man, every society, every institution. Once perceived, they cannot be ignored, and once ignored, they can no longer hold sway. By his 25th year, Edward Simmons was no longer just observed, he had become self-aware. The boy whose eyes never closed began to understand the weight of his existence, the burden of perception that no ordinary human could endure. Every glance, every observation, every unblinking moment carried with it the responsibility of truth. And Edward realized that he could not ignore it. The world, in all its hidden agendas and veiled corruption, was laid bare before him. It was a landscape of deception, power, and control, and he alone could perceive it fully. This awareness transformed him. Edward's life was no longer merely survival, it was purpose. He understood that those who sought to manipulate, dominate, or conceal were part of a larger system, a centuries-old network of influence built on ignorance, fear, and obedience. And while he could not dismantle it entirely, his presence had already begun to fracture it. Each interaction, each observation, each act of remaining unblinking and aware forced the hidden currents to reveal themselves, subtly reshaping the world around him. He had become an instrument of revelation, a living ledger of power and deception. But the cost was immense. Isolation weighed heavily on him, not just physically but psychologically. Men and women who had once approached him with curiosity now did so with fear. Friends, family, and townsfolk could not comprehend the enormity of his understanding. They sensed the depth of his awareness but were incapable of sharing it. And in solitude, Edward wrestled with the realization that to perceive without rest, to witness without reprieve, was both a gift and a curse. His consciousness had expanded beyond ordinary limits, and with that expansion came a haunting clarity. Truth is relentless, and it spares no one. And yet, in this isolation, Edward began to perceive patterns, connections, and forces that transcended his immediate world. He began to sense the psychological architectures embedded in societies, the subtle manipulations, the suppressed knowledge, the hierarchies of influence. He saw how human behavior was shaped, controlled, and exploited, often without the individuals themselves realizing it. And he understood that his unblinking eyes were not simply a curiosity. They were a weapon, a key, a mirror, and a guide. Now, as you listen, understand this. Edward's awakening is a metaphor for what happens when perception transcends the ordinary. When you begin to see the hidden networks, the subtle manipulations, the suppressed truths, you cannot return to ignorance. Awareness is power, but it is also responsibility. And Edward Simmons, the boy who never closed his eyes, carries both relentlessly, unflinchingly, and without compromise. By his 27th year, Edward Simmons was no longer merely observed. He had become the observer who could dismantle intentions before they were fully formed. Those who once sought to control him discovered that he could anticipate strategy, reveal hidden motives, and expose manipulation before a single word was spoken. Edward's unblinking eyes had become a force, silent yet undeniable, demonstrating that awareness alone can render power structures ineffective. Men and women who had plotted in shadows now found themselves visible in ways they could not counter. Attempts to co-opt him intensified. Elaborate schemes, hidden rituals, and clandestine negotiations were set into motion, each designed to harness his unique perception. Yet Edward responded not with defiance or confrontation, but with observation. He allowed plans to unfold only to reveal the consequences of human ambition and deceit naturally. Each failure of these schemes was a testament not to his intervention, but to the fragility of control when exposed to absolute awareness. Those who tried to dominate him found themselves ensnared in the very systems they had meticulously built, unraveling under the weight of transparency. The psychological impact on his adversaries was profound. Men of intellect and influence, confident in their mastery of manipulation, began to experience paranoia, anxiety, and uncertainty. Every action was second-guessed, every alliance questioned, every word analyzed for hidden intent. Edward's gaze became an invisible law, impartial yet absolute. It did not judge with emotion, it simply reflected truth, exposing weaknesses and intentions alike. No deception could pass unnoticed, no plot could be concealed. His presence alone was a disruption, a force that shattered hidden hierarchies without violence, without threat, without coercion. The town and its extended networks began to feel the ripple effects. Decisions in distant offices, actions in secret chambers, and subtle manipulations in personal relationships all faltered. Edward had become a conduit of revelation, a living mirror of human intention and power, and he did not act out of malice. He acted simply by being. The systems that relied on human blindness, on obedience, on the assumption that perception was limited, were undone by his presence. Now, Understand this, Edward's story is not merely historical curiosity. It is an illustration of how awareness can challenge entrenched systems of control. Knowledge, observation, and clarity of perception are more powerful than armies, more lethal than deception, and more transformative than laws. And as you listen, you are beginning to see the mechanisms that bind societies, influence behavior, and maintain hidden power. Edward Simmons is proof that a single mind, unbound and unblinking, can illuminate what others have spent lifetimes concealing. By his 30th year, Edward Simmons had transcended the simple boundaries of observation. His unblinking gaze began to penetrate forces older than government, older than societies, older than anything humanity thought it could control. Hidden beneath centuries of institutions were currents of power, psychological architectures, and secret knowledge that had been deliberately suppressed. Edward did not seek it. He observed, and it revealed itself. Ancient codes, forgotten rituals, and invisible hierarchies surfaced in his awareness, patterns that mapped not just human behavior, but the very mechanisms by which history had been shaped and manipulated. These were not stories or myths, they were structures of control, meticulously maintained over generations. Kings, priests, scholars, and secret councils had all participated in preserving them, ensuring that the masses remained compliant, obedient, and ignorant. And yet, Edward's presence made concealment impossible. Every act of manipulation, every hidden agenda, every psychological lever was exposed in the unrelenting clarity of his perception. The boy whose eyes never closed had become the living embodiment of awareness that transcends human comprehension. The implications were staggering. Not only were modern institutions fragile, but they were built atop layers of ancient influence, deliberately designed to suppress, shape, and control thought. Edward saw how knowledge had been deliberately obscured, how truths had been buried under centuries of superstition, law, and ritual. Those who thought themselves in control, elites, scholars, secret societies, were revealed as actors on a stage orchestrated by forces few could understand, and Edward, by existing, illuminated the stage. His awareness became a prism that refracted centuries of hidden corruption into stark, unavoidable clarity. Even those closest to him began to sense the magnitude of what he carried. Family, neighbors, scholars, they felt the weight of his perception. No conversation, no secret, no plan could escape it. Edward had become a living archive, a witness to the suppressed structures that controlled humanity, and he bore it silently, unflinching, uncompromising. His gaze was a warning, a revelation, and a challenge. Awareness is power, and ignorance is fragile. Now, as you follow this descent, understand what it means for your own perception. Edward Simmons is not merely history. He is a demonstration of what happens when awareness meets hidden power, when perception pierces deception, and when truth refuses to be ignored. And once seen, once fully understood, these truths change not just knowledge, they change the very way a man experiences the world. By his 32nd year, Edward Simmons had become an unavoidable force. Those who had once attempted to manipulate or exploit him now faced consequences they could neither predict nor control. Every plan, every hidden agenda, every carefully orchestrated scheme began to crumble in the presence of his unblinking eyes. Edward did not strike. He did not confront directly. He merely existed, and the systems of power began to collapse from within. What men had spent lifetimes building, layering secrecy upon secrecy, unraveled as if the architecture itself could not withstand scrutiny. Operatives, scholars, and secret societies began to panic. They had believed that centuries of hidden knowledge and psychological control could contain a single mind. They had assumed that rituals, intimidation, and authority could force compliance. But Edward's presence was proof of their fatal miscalculation. Perception, absolute and unblinking, renders all manipulation irrelevant. Every strategy designed to control him backfired, not because of overt resistance, but because awareness cannot be deceived. Their plots became self-revealing, their intentions transparent, and their power fragile in ways they had never imagined. Even larger systems began to falter. Institutions that relied on human compliance, religious hierarchies, governmental offices, educational structures were subtly, irreversibly altered by the silent observation of a single individual. Edward's gaze did not merely detect corruption, it exposed the weaknesses in the very design of power. Policies shifted, alliances failed, and the illusion of control that had maintained social order for centuries began to crack. And he did not intervene, he did not dictate, he merely saw, and seeing alone was enough. What is crucial to understand is this. Edward Simmons is proof that perception is more powerful than force. Structures of power, networks of manipulation, and psychological control systems depend on human blindness, obedience, and ignorance. Once awareness transcends these limits, once a mind perceives unflinchingly, the entire edifice becomes unstable. Edward had become a living demonstration that knowledge cannot be contained and truth cannot be suppressed. And now, as you follow this journey, recognize your own position in this unfolding reality. Awareness, once awakened, becomes both weapon and shield. The forces you think are immutable, the secrets you believe are hidden, they are vulnerable to perception. And Edward Simmons, the boy whose eyes never closed, embodies the ultimate lesson. Unblinking clarity exposes everything, and once seen, the world can never return to the comfortable illusion of ignorance. By his 35th year, Edward Simmons had become something almost mythic. No longer confined to the small town where he was born, his presence and the ripple of awareness he carried began to touch far-reaching networks of power. Hidden agendas in distant cities, clandestine councils that shaped policies across nations, and secret alliances that controlled wealth and information all experienced subtle disruptions. Decisions that were meant to remain hidden were exposed through patterns only Edward could perceive. Even the most sophisticated systems of concealment faltered when confronted with unblinking awareness. Men and women who had once believed themselves untouchable now quivered under observation they could not anticipate. Edward's gaze, though silent and indirect, revealed inconsistencies, premeditated lies, and psychological manipulations they had thought invisible. Letters, transactions, secret meetings, all became transparent, not through force or violence, but through the power of perception itself. The boy whose eyes never closed had become the vector through which centuries of control were illuminated, unmasking human agendas on a scale previously unimaginable. Secret societies that had manipulated rulers and economies for generations began to crumble quietly, internally, without public exposure. Their systems depended on ignorance, secrecy, and obedience. Edward's perception invalidated these assumptions. Patterns of influence, predatory alliances, and hidden economic levers became visible to him, and the consequences radiated outward. Leaders who relied on deception found their authority undermined, not through public scandal, but through internal fractures that only absolute awareness can induce. Edward had become the unblinking witness to the architecture of human power, forcing it to self-correct or collapse. Even global events, historical narratives, and societal shifts bore the imprint of his gaze. Edward did not intervene directly, yet subtle outcomes aligned with his observations. Human behavior, when confronted with an uncompromising mirror, adjusts unconsciously. The world shifted around him, a testament to the principle that awareness, when absolute, has the power to transform systems, and he remained silent, observing, recording, and existing as the unyielding proof that truth is stronger than manipulation and clarity is more potent than force. Now, pause and reflect. What Edward represents is not only historical or extraordinary, it is universal. Knowledge, perception, and awareness are forces that every man carries within him, yet few cultivate. And once awakened, they cannot be ignored. Edward Simmons teaches a simple, terrifying lesson. The structures of power, no matter how entrenched, crumble under unflinching observation. And awareness, once absolute, reshapes everything it touches. By his 38th year, Edward Simmons had moved beyond the ordinary boundaries of human comprehension. His gaze was no longer merely a tool of observation. It had become a lens through which the deepest human fears, desires, and vulnerabilities were revealed. He perceived the hidden motivations behind every action, the suppressed impulses that guided decisions, the invisible levers of control that shaped societies, families, and institutions, and he bore witness to it all without rest, without judgment, and without compromise. The psychological impact on those who encountered him was profound. Men who believed themselves cunning, clever, or untouchable found themselves unraveling under the weight of a presence that could perceive every hidden intent. Scholars documented trembling hands, faltering speech, and moments of unexplainable terror. Operatives whose lives had been spent manipulating human behavior discovered that the boy, now a man, could see patterns and truths before they were even formulated. Edward had become a living algorithm of perception, a mind unbound by fatigue or limitation, capable of exposing the fragile scaffolding of human control. Yet Edward did not intervene directly. He did not punish, coerce, or correct. His power lay in observation, in the unblinking mirror of awareness that reflected everything without distortion. And as he watched, men and women were forced to confront themselves. Lies dissolved, ambitions faltered, moral compromises were revealed, and human constructs of authority and secrecy proved weaker than anyone had imagined. His unblinking eyes became a crucible of truth, unforgiving, precise, and absolute. The existential weight of this knowledge was immense, not just for those around him, but for Edward himself. He began to grasp the burden of being a witness to the hidden currents of humanity. To perceive absolute truth, to see the machinery behind history and society, is to shoulder a responsibility few could bear. And yet he endured, not as a conqueror, but as a sentinel, a living testament to the cost of awareness and the price of seeing without rest. Now consider this for yourself. Awareness is not passive, perception shapes reality, and Edward Simmons embodies the principle that once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. The structures of control, the hidden systems of manipulation, the suppressed histories, all are vulnerable to perception, and those who dare to cultivate such awareness as Edward did enter a world that is as terrifying as it is enlightening. This is the edge of forbidden knowledge, and standing here is where a man begins to understand the full depth of power, truth, and consequence. By his 40th year, Edward Simmons had become more than a man. He had become a phenomenon, a living testament to what it means to perceive without pause, to witness without bias, and to exist as the ultimate mirror of truth. The boy whose eyes never closed had shown the fragility of human constructs, the vulnerability of secret knowledge, and the impermanence of power built on ignorance. Entire networks, societies, and systems of influence had been subtly reshaped simply by the presence of one unblinking observer. He had revealed that control is only as strong as the blindness of those it seeks to dominate. The forces that once sought to exploit him had either collapsed from internal unraveling or learned to fear his observation. Scholars, operatives, and clandestine organizations realized too late that Edward was not a tool to be wielded. He was a force beyond containment, and yet he remained silent, not out of neutrality alone, but because silence amplifies true. The words can lie, observation does not. Edward's unblinking eyes became a warning and a lesson. Awareness cannot be corrupted, truth cannot be hidden, and perception can render even the most fortified structures powerless. His legacy was not built in monuments or accolades, nor in recorded history that the public could access. His impact was subtle, invisible to the untrained eye, yet profound in its effect. Governments adjusted without understanding why. Societies shifted without explanation. Individuals found themselves forced to confront hidden truths within themselves, and the world's hidden hierarchies trembled under the unblinking clarity of a single life lived fully aware. Edward's story is a reminder that the most powerful force is not violence, not wealth, not influence, but awareness. Absolute, relentless, and uncompromising. And now, as you sit with this knowledge, understand the weight it carries. What Edward Simmons demonstrated is a principle every man can grasp. See clearly, understand deeply, observe relentlessly, and nothing can remain hidden from you. The world is constructed on illusion and compliance, and awareness alone dismantles both. You have followed his journey through forbidden knowledge, secret agendas, and psychological exposure. You have descended into truths most fear to acknowledge. And if you carry even a fraction of Edward's clarity within your own perception, you will see the world not as it pretends to be, but as it truly is. Remember this, and let it change you. Because once you open your eyes fully, once you refuse to blink in the face of deception, the world will never appear the same again. Edward Simmons' life is the proof. Awareness is power, truth is relentless, and perception is the most dangerous weapon ever known.